Hey there, good morning. I'm Paige Browning. It's Tuesday. This is Seattle Now. It's day 2 of the 2026 legislative session at Washington State's Capitol. Do you know what your lawmakers are up to? For one, they've got to plug the state's $2 billion budget hole. Are millionaires part of the answer? We'll get the scoop from Paul Query, editor and publisher of the Washington Observer. But first, let's get you caught up. Can you say revive I-5? Buckle up, sorry for the pun, because it's going to be slow on Interstate 5 in Seattle for a while. Only half of the lanes, 2 in total, are open on I-5 North over the Ship Canal Bridge, and it's going to stay down to 2 lanes until June. Then, after the Soccer World Cup here, lanes close again until sometime next year. WashDOT's asking people to find other transportation options and asking employers to let people arrive before 7 a.m. or after 10 a.m. Maybe ferry travel is a nicer thing to think about. And we've got news. Washington State Ferries is going to try offering Wi-Fi again this summer. The Seattle Times reports the Wi-Fi pilot's limited to the Bremerton terminal and the Bremerton to Seattle ferry, the Chimacum. Ferry officials will report to the legislature in September, and if the pilot goes well, the state could pay the multi-million dollars needed to expand Wi-Fi fleet-wide. And today is Governor Bob Ferguson's State of the State address. It'll likely sound a lot different from his inaugural address last year. Then, he opposed taxes on big businesses and wealthy residents. Now, the governor says he backs a proposed tax on millionaires. The speech is at noon in front of both the Washington House and Senate. Check back for more headlines on tonight's episode of Seattle Now.
The Senate will be in order. The Secretary will call the roll.
Alvarado, Bateman, thank you.
The brand new
Strong,
legislative session
Chapman,
kicked off this week
Christian,
in Olympia.
Cleveland,
It's a short session this time around, just 60 days, and state lawmakers have a lot to figure out, especially the budget that's still underwater. And if you don't follow the ledge too closely, we got you. Paul Query's here to help explain what lawmakers are up to this session. He's editor and publisher of the Washington Observer, a Substack newsletter. Hey, Paul, thanks for coming on the show.
I'm happy to be with you, Paige.
What is the theme of this year's session, if you had to pick?
So I think there's 2 themes that are sort of both related to how much money is available. Theme 1 is balancing the budget in the short term, which is going to require some degree of cutting the budget and or raising, existing taxes. And theme 2 is sort of what you might think of as the long-term revenue and tax structure system. There's been a big push for years by progressive Democrats to impose some kind of tax on the wealthy, whether that be a wealth tax or an income tax on the very highest earners and so on and so forth. That doesn't solve the short-term budgetary problem, but it's a really long-term goal of folks on the left, and this is increasingly looking like the year that that might happen.
I want to ask along these lines about the millionaire's tax. The name alone sort of sounds like something out of Monopoly. I don't know, the game. But our governor, Bob Ferguson, has said he will support a so-called millionaire's tax, which Democrats are proposing. This bill calls for a 10% tax on income higher than $1 million in a given year. Where did this come from, or what's the story here?
I mean, the story behind this is many progressives are frustrated by the lack of an income tax because Washington's tax system in general falls pretty heavily on the poor and very lightly on the wealthy, especially the very wealthy. And there have been a lot of discussions about how to fix that in some way and make the tax system a little fairer. And the solution that they seem to have settled on is this tax on the income of the very wealthy, so the millionaire's tax. And, that's a sort of thorny question because there's a state Supreme Court ruling from the 1930s that effectively makes that kind of tax unconstitutional.
Yeah, I was going to ask about this because, if a bill does come forward and this is passed to tax millionaires on their income, is that going to hold up?
Well, I think it's going to face 2 really significant challenges. One, it has to go before the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court would as I understand it, essentially have to reverse that ruling from the 1930s, which is considered in some legal circles to be wrong.
And remind us what that 30s ruling said.
So that case is called Cullen, and it was a challenge to an income tax that was imposed at that time. And the court found essentially that your money is your property and therefore subject to the Constitution's restriction on property tax. That makes a progressive income tax like Oregon's, for example, unconstitutional. And then the other problem that such a tax would face is that it would almost inevitably get forced to the ballot box. There would be a referendum campaign or an initiative campaign to force a public vote. And this hasn't been on the ballot in some years. The last time was in 2010, when a similar high earners income tax was put before the voters via ballot initiatives. But in all the previous cases, this idea has gone down in flames. So the question about whether the voters would be on board is open.
Okay, we'll watch what happens with the millionaire's tax. How about taxing corporations instead? That's what State Representative Sean Scott of Seattle's proposing. His bill would make companies pay a payroll tax on its salaries above $125,000. Does this one have a chance?
So that's a variation on the Jumpstart tax, which your listeners in Seattle probably already know about because Seattle already has a version of that was imposed at the city level. And there are a couple of controversial issues around that. The major employers of people who make that kind of money sort of argue that it would prompt them or force them to move their employees elsewhere so they wouldn't be subject to the tax. There's also a problem because as written, Representative Scott's bill would exempt Seattle from this state Jumpstart tax because the city already has this tax, which would put that whole tax burden from a state perspective on everybody else in the state.
Everyone but Seattle. I'm sure the rest of the state will love that.
Yeah, and if I'm a member of the Democratic majority, and the Republicans are no on this idea to start with, but if I'm a member of the Democratic majority and I'm not from Seattle, might be a no vote on that. That idea was floated last year during the, sort of similar tax debate and didn't ultimately wind up going anywhere.
And I understand there are some discussions about initiatives this year. Can you talk about one that is looking at reining in that process?
Yeah, there's a proposal. This was brought forth by the Political Action Committee called Defend Washington, which you may remember from the 2024 campaign was in opposition to the slate of conservative initiatives that were pushed by Let's Go Washington. And they've proposed this bill, which is in play in both the House and the Senate now, which would impose a signature requirement. You'd have to gather 1,000 signatures before you even offered the initiative to the Secretary of State's office. And that's designed to keep people from filing multiple versions of the same initiative in the hope of getting a favorable ballot title, which is essentially initiative sponsors kind of putting their legal work on the state. It would also ban the practice of paying signature gatherers by the signature. And critics of that practice argue that it lends itself to fraud and unethical signature gathering practices of various kinds. But probably the bottom line from the initiative sponsor standpoint is it would just make things a lot more expensive.
If this passed, it would make it more expensive to file initiatives and just harder in general to file an initiative. And why would people on the left want that?
In general, because there have been a lot of initiatives in recent years and then, the last couple of decades that were designed to undo things that the legislature had done. And
we're talking about Tim Eyman proposals.
Right. Tim Eyman back in the day with his tax limitation measures and his requirement that most tax increases go before the voters before they could be enacted. And then more recently, the Let's Go Washington efforts. That rubs a lot of Democrats in the legislature the wrong way to have these fights, at the ballot box every year or two about what they did. And so they'd like to, to rein that in. But the interesting angle there is that these burdens would fall equally on the left if, you had ballot initiatives to, to try and move something there. I mean, it would change the playing field for everybody in the initiative game.
Yeah. We voted to legalize cannabis. That was an initiative.
Yeah, that's right.
502. Yeah. So it would play both sides. And speaking of initiatives, you talked about Let's Go Washington. They have 2 initiatives to the legislature this year. One would ban transgender girls and teens from playing girls' sports, and the other is about this Parents' Bill of Rights. I'm putting that in quotes, that would give parents more access to kids' mental health and medical records at school. The legislature can vote yes on these or vote no or do nothing. What do you expect? It's week one.
Both Senate Majority Leader Jamie Peterson and House Speaker Lori Jenkins said that they're not going to take up either of those initiatives. And that means that those initiatives almost certainly wind up before the voters in the fall, unless they get thrown out for some other reason. There'll probably be some legal challenges between now and then. And in the case of the Parents' Bill of Rights, the original Parents' Bill of Rights was put forward by Let's Go Washington before the 2024 legislature. The legislature adopted it rather than let it go to the ballot because they thought it would be popular and might drive Republican votes. That allowed them the following year to change it. There's a lot of debate about what exactly it would have done in terms of forcing school districts to tell parents certain things about what their kids were doing.
Sure, protection of LGBTQ youth or seeing a counselor at school, etc.
Exactly. So that repeal passed. It was very controversial last year. And the initiative that they're putting on the ballot this year is essentially to overturn that repeal and restore the original Parents' Bill of Rights that was approved by the legislature in 2024. It's getting a little convoluted.
I'm smiling because it is complicated to follow this, but basically they're saying the legislature passed our initiative and then they changed it, so we're bringing it back again.
Yeah. And from the legislature's perspective, or at least from the majority Democrats' perspective in the legislature, that question's asked and answered, right? They had that debate last year and they certainly don't want to have it again. I mean, it was 4 or 5 nights of all night bitter, divisive, partisan debate. And, I don't think there's much appetite for that. On the trans girls in sports question, that initiative is viewed on the left as anti-trans discrimination. And there are a lot of progressive heavyweights who are lined up against it, including the Washington Education Association. Now, the sponsors frame it as an attempt to restore fairness and integrity in girls' sports.
Even the playing field.
Also, to your earlier point, the legislature doesn't have a lot of options here. I mean, they could either approve those initiatives or they could approve an alternative to appear alongside the initiative in the fall, or they can just ignore them and let them go to the ballot. And historically, lawmakers have chosen option 3 the vast majority of the time.
Yeah, it is seen on the left and by LGBTQ rights advocates as an absolute non-starter, something they just don't want to touch. So we'll see if that ends up in front of voters. Paul, is there any other bill you want to mention? One thing we should watch for?
One thing we're watching pretty closely, because we like to follow housing policy, because that's an area where the legislature can really move the needle to try and improve the supply of housing. And this is a bill that's introduced at the behest of Governor Bob Ferguson, and it would essentially require local governments to change the zoning to allow housing development and mixed use development in commercial zones. So this is aimed at, if you think about all those strip malls and all those big box retail spaces that are empty because Amazon has sort of like sucked away all their customers, this would allow
RIP Best Buy.
Right, exactly. This would allow housing development in those places. In many cases, those places are actually pretty well situated for certain kinds of high volume housing because they're on major thoroughfares, they're close to transit, so there's ample parking, et cetera, and so forth. So that's an interesting idea to get at. We watch housing pretty closely all the time, and we're going to keep a close eye on that one, and it gets a hearing on Friday, I think. Okay.
Strip malls for housing, a bill on the governor's wish list. We'll watch that one too. Paul Query is the editor and publisher of the Washington Observer, a Substack newsletter. Paul, thank you so much for the primer.
I'm happy to help.
Thank you for listening to Seattle Now, and thanks to our generous donors for their support. You can give to KUOW and Seattle Now by clicking the link in the show notes, or support us by following, rating, and reviewing the show right there on your podcast app. Today's episode was produced by Andy Hurst. It was edited by Caroline Chamberlain Gomez. Our production team also includes Vaughn Jones, Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and Patricia Murphy. Greg Kramer does our theme music. Seattle Now and KUOW Public Radio are members of the NPR network. I'm Paige Browning, and I'll see you tonight for Evening Headlines.